The United States often presents itself as the world's biggest defender of free markets and fair competition. But here's the contradiction that has stunned many people in Europe. The same U.S. government is now pressuring Greece to push China out of a port that Greece legally sold through an open market deal. Think about that for a moment. This isn't a secret negotiation or a leaked document. American officials have openly urged Greece to remove China from the port of Piraeus, Greece's largest port, and hinted that the U.S. would be a safer replacement partner. That kind of demand is unusual, especially between allies. So naturally, it raises a powerful question. Why this port? Why now? And most importantly, why does a single harbor in the Mediterranean Sea make Washington so nervous? At first glance, it sounds boring. A port, containers, cranes, ships moving boxes from one place to another. Not exactly the stuff of global drama. But that's the illusion. Because ports are not just concrete and steel. They are the arteries of the global economy. About 90% of world trade moves by sea, and whoever controls the key ports doesn't just move goods. They influence prices, supply chains, and even political decisions. This is not really about Greece choosing China over the U.S. It's not even just about shipping. This is about who controls the flow of trade into Europe. Who decides which routes are fast, which are slow, and which countries sit at the center of global commerce. In today's world, power doesn't always arrive on aircraft carriers. Sometimes it arrives on cargo ships. And to understand why Washington is so alarmed, we first need to understand what kind of port Piraeus actually is, and why it matters far more than most people realize. But here's the twist. Despite its incredible location, despite all this strategic potential, Piraeus was once considered a failure. A port so badly run that shipping companies avoided it whenever possible. And that brings us to the part of the story most people have forgotten. Because just 15 years ago, this gateway was almost abandoned. It's hard to believe today, but the port of Piraeus was once a symbol of failure. In the mid-2000s, Greece was quietly hiding the true size of its government debt. When the truth finally came out, the shock hit like an earthquake. By 2009, Greece's financial system was collapsing, and the country was pushed into one of the worst debt crises in modern European history. The port was caught directly in the blast. Government funding was slashed almost overnight. The state-owned Piraeus Port Authority suddenly had no money to maintain equipment, modernize facilities, or even keep operations running smoothly. Workers went on strike again and again over unpaid wages. Ships arrived, but no one was there to unload them. And things only got worse. The port had no modern IT systems. Scheduling was chaotic. Containers were stacked randomly in overcrowded yards. If a crane broke down, repairs could take weeks, not hours or days. At night, the lighting was so poor that workers often refused to operate at all. Imagine a modern airport with broken radar, flickering runway lights, and no digital systems. That's what Piraeus had become, except at sea. As a result, unloading a ship in Piraeus often took 1 to 3 days longer than in competing ports. For shipping companies, that delay was unacceptable. Time lost meant money lost. Inside the industry, a brutal joke began to circulate. Avoid Piraeus unless you have absolutely no choice. The numbers tell the same story. At the time, Piraeus handled only about 700,000 TEUs a year. Meanwhile, ports like Valencia, Barcelona, and Genoa were already handling over 4 million TEUs annually. These ports weren't just bigger, they were faster, cheaper, and more reliable. So ships began to bypass Greece entirely. Despite its perfect location near the Suez Canal, cargo piled up untouched. The port was slow, disorganized, outdated, and expensive, the worst combination possible in global shipping. By the time Greece's debt crisis fully exploded, one thing became clear. The government could no longer afford to keep the port alive. Selling it seemed like the only option. But when Greece finally looked for buyers, something unexpected happened. No one in the West wanted it. And that's when a single player stepped forward, willing to take a risk that everyone else refused to touch. When Greece decided to offer the port of Piraeus to investors, the response was almost silence. European companies studied the port and walked away. American firms showed no interest at all. To them, Piraeus looked like a bottomless pit. Aging infrastructure, labor problems, political risk, and no guarantee of profit for years. From a short-term business perspective, they were right. Fixing Piraeus would require massive investment, patience, and a willingness to lose money before seeing any return. Most investors weren't prepared to do that, but in 2009, one company made a very different calculation. A subsidiary of COSCO Shipping, a major Chinese state-owned shipping group, stepped in. Instead of buying the port outright, COSCO signed a 35-year concession agreement. The deal was structured carefully. A relatively small upfront payment, long-term revenue sharing, lease and equipment usage fees paid over time. In other words, China didn't demand quick profits. It tied its returns to whether the port actually succeeded. This detail matters. If COSCO failed to improve the port, it wouldn't make money. The risk was real, and it was shared. At the time, many critics dismissed the move. Some said China was throwing money into a broken asset. Others claimed the port was simply unfixable. But COSCO wasn't betting on politics. It was betting on logistics. Then came the next major step. In 2016, after years of operating and upgrading the port, COSCO increased its commitment, acquiring 51% of the Piraeus Port Authority. This wasn't a speculative flip. It was a long-term investment, with plans to expand further only if performance targets were met. This is an important point that often gets ignored. This was not a military takeover. It was not a backroom deal. It was not a political seizure. It was a commercial rescue, carried out through open tenders and legal contracts at a moment when no Western company was willing to step in. And once China committed fully, the real transformation of Piraeus began. Because what happened next changed the port and Europe's logistics map forever. Once China committed fully to Piraeus, the approach was simple but relentless. Fix everything that was broken, and modernize everything that was outdated. The first priority was the physical port itself. The channels were deepened so larger ships could enter. Quay walls were reinforced to handle heavier loads. Entirely new berths were built to accommodate ultra-large container vessels, the giants of modern shipping that older ports simply can't handle. Then came the technology. Old, unreliable machinery was replaced with high-capacity cranes, including some of the most advanced container cranes in the world. Automated yards were introduced, allowing containers to be stacked and moved efficiently instead of randomly. A modern digital management system was installed so operators could finally see, in real time, where every container was and where it needed to go. This wasn't cosmetic change. It was a full system upgrade. An AI-assisted logistics platform was introduced to plan yard operations, reducing congestion and delays. Management structures were reorganized, decision-making was streamlined, and performance targets were enforced. Broken equipment was fixed in hours or days, not weeks. The result was dramatic. Ships that once waited days were now unloaded quickly. Turnaround times dropped sharply. Reliability improved, and global shipping companies noticed. Major players like Maersk, MSC, and Ocean Alliance members began designating Piraeus as a key calling port. Cargo flows surged back, and then surpassed anything seen before. By the year 2020, the numbers spoke for themselves. Annual throughput exceeded 5.7 million TEUs. Piraeus ranked among the top 3 ports in the Mediterranean. It consistently placed within the top 10 ports in all of Europe. The global shipping industry had a name for this turnaround. They called it the Piraeus Miracle. A port that was once avoided at all costs had become one of Europe's most efficient logistics hubs, not because of geography alone, but because someone was finally willing to invest, modernize, and wait for results. And that success sent a clear message far beyond Greece, a message that immediately caught Washington's attention. The United States is not alarmed by the port of Piraeus because it failed. It's alarmed because it worked. Piraeus has become one of the clearest examples in Europe of China's infrastructure-led development model. Invest heavily, modernize fast, and integrate logistics into global trade networks. In policy language, this is often linked to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In practical terms, it means turning broken infrastructure into functioning economic engines. For Washington, this creates several problems. First, influence. When China operates a major European port, it gains a foothold in continental logistics. That doesn't mean military control, but it does mean visibility, relationships, and long-term economic influence. Ports connect to railways. Railways connect to factories. Factories shape jobs, taxes, and political decisions. Second, strategic autonomy. U.S. officials worry that if key transport hubs in southern Europe are closely linked to China, Europe's ability to coordinate economically and strategically with the United States could weaken. This concern becomes even sharper when NATO member countries are involved. That's why American officials have repeatedly called for Greece to balance China's influence and warned about vague security risks. These warnings are often broad and undefined, but the message is clear. China's success in Piraeus is seen as a strategic loss for the U.S., but the deepest fear runs even deeper. Piraeus is not just a port, it is proof. Proof that Chinese capital can revive Western infrastructure. Proof that long-term investment can deliver results where short-term profit failed. And proof that cooperation with China doesn't automatically lead to collapse or dependency. From Washington's perspective, this is dangerous, because if one country succeeds, others may ask the same question. Why not us? If Italy, Spain, Eastern Europe, or even parts of Northern Europe follow the same path, the U.S. risks losing influence not through conflict, but through comparison. And that brings us to Greece's response. A response shaped not by ideology, but by memory. Because Greece remembers who showed up when it mattered most. When U.S. officials suggested that Greece should push China out of the port of Piraeus, the Greek response was short, clear, and emotional. China helped us during our most difficult time. We will not drive away our Chinese friends. That sentence explains everything. During the darkest years of Greece's debt crisis, the country was on the edge of bankruptcy. Foreign investment fled. Credit dried up. Unemployment soared. The economy nearly stopped breathing. At that moment, most Western investors pulled back. Risk was too high. Returns were too uncertain. China did the opposite. China continued investing in the port of Piraeus when others refused. It publicly stated its willingness to buy Greek government bonds when few countries would touch them. That support helped stabilize Greece's finances at a critical moment. And it didn't stop there. China increased imports of Greek agricultural products, providing lifelines to rural regions and island economies. Greek food products appeared in Chinese supermarkets, opening access to one of the world's largest consumer markets. When Greece's tourism industry collapsed, Chinese tourists were among the first to return, bringing badly needed revenue when hotels and businesses were struggling to survive. Beyond the port, Chinese companies invested in key sectors of the Greek economy, including shares in the national power grid operator, logistics centers, and shipping-related industries. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were long-term commitments tied to Greece's recovery. So from Greece's perspective, the choice is not complicated. This is not about choosing China over the U.S. It's about honoring partnerships that delivered real results when they mattered most. And there's another principle at play here: sovereignty. The port of Piraeus belongs to Greece. It is not a chess piece for global powers to fight over. Decisions about its future, its operators, and its partners should be made in Athens, not in Washington or Brussels. For Greece, Replacing a proven investor with empty promises would be a gamble with real lives, real jobs, and real economic stability. And that leads us to the final unavoidable question. What does this story really tell us about power in the modern world? When you strip away the politics, the headlines, and the finger-pointing, the story of the port of Piraeus reveals a much deeper truth about the modern world. This is not simply China versus the United States. It is investment versus abandonment. For years, Piraeus was ignored because fixing it wasn't fast, easy, or immediately profitable. When the crisis hit, warnings came from the West, but money, risk, and long-term commitment did not. China stepped in where others stepped away, and the results are now impossible to deny. That's the real source of discomfort. In today's world, power doesn't only come from military strength or political speeches. It comes from who builds things that last. Ports, railways, power grids, supply chains. These are the foundations of real economic influence. Whoever builds the infrastructure shapes the future, not by force, but by function. Greece's quiet message to the world is simple. Development matters more than ideology. Promises matter less than performance. The port of Piraeus didn't become successful because of slogans or alliances. It became successful because it was rebuilt, modernized, and connected to global trade in a serious way. And ports don't lie. They either move goods efficiently, or they don't. They either create jobs, or they don't. They either generate growth, or they don't. In the case of Piraeus, the results speak louder than warnings. As global competition shifts from battlefields to balance sheets, stories like this will become more common and more important to understand. If you want to stay ahead of these global shifts, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay informed as the world's power map continues to change, not with explosions, but with cranes, containers, and concrete.